threats of tariffs make Canada great again? And will the threats of Donald Trump make us actually a stronger and better country? Now, before people push back on this, I just want to take a look at the situation with the US right now and just remind everyone that there's an old saying, that which does not kill me makes me stronger. Now, while everyone is talking about the impact of tariffs, it's really hard to say at the moment, which direction this is all going. But if you look below the rhetoric and you start to look at the conversation that's starting to happen, there's just been a tremendous shift. And in my opinion, all to the benefit of Canada. Finally, we're talking about acting like a sovereign nation, protecting its own best interests. We've been asleep at the wheel for the last 10, 15 years, and now we're waking up from our slumber. And regardless of what you think about Donald Trump or any of this talk of tariffs, this is really great news because Canadians are hurting. Affordability is hurting our economy, our productivity, our GDP per capita, our social network. It's all in free fall. So it's unfortunate that it took an outside threat to cause us to take a look at ourselves and wake up. But what's happening, I believe, is actually a really good thing. I think it's amazing that we're now realizing that there is some level of a fentanyl and drug problem here in Canada. Now, if you look at some of the articles and podcasts by Sam Cooper, who's a journalist who's been writing and talking about this for a long time, he's now coming to prominence because he's been talking about the depth of the fentanyl issue for a very long time. And I think it's running to a much larger extent than most people would ever have imagined, myself included. And, you know, when you have a drug lab in BC that was recently busted that has enough of the components of fentanyl to kill every single Canadian, you realize that there might be a problem. When you discover that the ports, which is where a lot of this activity is happening, not over the land border, which the Liberal government keeps pointing to only 1% being confiscated, but I'm talking out of our shipping, and you understand that it's all run by Chinese, and this cargo is almost never inspected, you start to sort of question things. And then you see the stats, and who knows if even this is accurate, but it's saying that there's 50,000 Canadians have died of fentanyl. I mean, that's unacceptable. If you ever drive through East Hastings, you realize that we have a problem. We recently were away in Argentina, and we were in Buenos Aires, a third world country. And yes, there was homeless, but they were a different type of homeless. They were just minding their own business, and they were very peaceful. In Toronto, you walk through any street and you see homeless people, very aggressive, very strung out. It is very common for myself and my wife to have to cross the street back and forth multiple times to avoid somebody just screaming at the top of their lungs, drugged out. This was not a problem in Canada 4 or 5 years ago. So things here are definitely changing, and it's really, really important, at least from my lens, to think that there might be a fentanyl czar in charge of looking after these issues, and maybe some greater accountability, and who knows, maybe even stronger criminal system to support new legislation that we can bring in to clamp down on this. And again, like one of the things that really didn't get much traction here in the news, but we had TD Bank, which was fined $3 billion. $3 billion. I think it was the largest fine in the United States on a bank for money laundering with the drug cartels in Mexico and for its involvement in the trade of fentanyl, which is just absolutely absurd. So there's definitely more going on than meets the eye. And if you listen to Sam Cooper, it's systemically deep, and it almost sounds like large parts of our country have been compromised by the Chinese. I can't verify whether that's true or not, but a lot is coming to the surface with this conversation, and starting to deal with it, I think for me is the most best aspect of all of these threats that are coming against Canada. And then you have border security. Every country should make it a real priority to have secure borders. And now we're spending over $1 billion to secure our borders. I think it's incredible that we have making this effort. And just along the Albertan border with the U.S., we had 18 people arrested, and I think a couple were actually killed in securing our border. So it's really important that we know who's coming across and that we have some way to control the back and forth flow of people and goods, and they're able to better monitor and secure it. And I don't don't think that's a big ask. And I do think it's really, really important, if you want to be a sovereign country, to be able to secure your own borders. So I think this is another great result of some of the conversations that are happening as a result of these massive tariff threats that are now facing Canada. And then we have energy. Like, for God sakes, let's run pipelines coast to coast. Like, I can't believe we don't already have liquefied natural gas to ready buyers, like, that we've turned down. Japan wants our liquefied natural gas. Germany would love to take it. There are so many countries around the world that would love our clean energy. And why we can't get out of our own way and reduce some of our economic dependence on the US, it's just absolutely mind-boggling. And it's amazing now to see the government, the Liberal government, all of a sudden, and premiers willing to have this conversation to something that was a dead zone, no-go for the last decade and a half. Imagine where we'd be today if we had those pipelines running and ships with liquefied natural gas going out around the world. We would be a lot wealthier as a country. We'd be able to support a lot of our social initiatives, and I think our GDP per capita would be a lot higher today. So, again, another really important conversation to have when a gun is being held to your head. And it's unfortunate that this has had to happen, but again, like, this is something that's great to see. Trade barriers, provincial trade barriers. This is something that drives me crazy. And it's the fact that it's in most cases easier for businesses or companies to trade within a province to the United States than it is to trade across Canada, because of all the regulations and all the barriers that we have up. And of course, once this threat came through, all of a sudden, our government in power is now saying we can have all these taken down in 30 days. And there's a commitment so that we could have trade amongst ourselves, let alone with the US or other neighbors around the world. I mean, it is just unbelievable that haven't gotten to a point where this has even been a discussion until 2025, when these threats came through. Let's talk about NATO. Let's talk about defense. Every NATO country has an obligation to live up to 2% of its GDP to pay for its share of the cost to support the importance of having NATO. Canada has fallen far below that mark, and it's one of the bones of the United States, who basically is paying for our protection and feeling like we're coming along for a free ride, saying, you guys, if you want to be a country, you need to live up to your commitments. And there is nothing wrong, in my opinion, for a sovereign country to have a strong military. And we have let all of that fall completely away. And I think the US is saying, we're sick of it. You guys got to pay up. And now all of a sudden, Freeland says that we're going to hit our 2% by 2027. Now, she wasn't saying that before these tariffs, the threat of these tariffs came on. It's only in response to it. So again, now we're talking about having a stronger military and actually investing into our military. It's just unbelievable that this had to happen for this conversation to come aboard. And now you have candidates across all the spectrum saying they would support getting rid of the proposed new capital gains tax that was brought in by the Liberal government in the fall. Now it's like, oh my gosh, we have to be competitive. We have to actually compete with other countries, and we can't just keep taxing Canadians to death. We have to take the burden off of Canadians so we can have a stronger economy. Unbelievable that only happened, this conversation, and all of our sitting government willing to get rid of the carbon tax, all the candidates that are running to become the appointed prime minister of Canada, as our government is prorogued, they won't support the capital gains increase, they won't support the carbon tax, and all of a sudden they want to take down these taxes so we can be more competitive. Now, why weren't we talking about that in the fall? What had to happen for us to have to talk about that? And then, even immigration, all of a sudden we're talking about, we can't even track where a lot of the people who've come into Canada are and whether they're still here or they've left. We don't have a great immigration policy, as I'm sure many of our viewers understand, just watching what's gone on the last few years. And all of a sudden there's talk about actually linking and tracking our immigration policy coming into the country. And let's talk about this flag waving Canadian patriotism that we've seen over the last couple weeks. It just absolutely blows my mind. We've seen so many attacks on our identity as Canadians in the name of inclusivity. I don't even know where to begin. If you look at the new passport, we've been stripped of our ID. If you hold the new passport versus the old passport, they removed Terry Fox. I mean, what is so offensive about Terry Fox from the new passport? And now we just have like some bears and pictures of lakes. All of the identity for so long has been item by item stripped away from what it is to be Canadian. I have a friend and she's immigrated here and she's taking her citizenship exam, and I asked her, who's the first prime minister of Canada? And she couldn't even answer the question. She didn't know who Sir John A. Macdonald is. Imagine trying to become a US citizen and not knowing who George Washington is. It wasn't even on the curriculum that she was told to study about. And, it just seems like step by step in Canada, we're almost made to not feel Canadian or somewhat apologetic about it because we're just letting as many people from around the world in as we can in the name of multiculturalism. I think our identity has really, really been stripped. And then all of a sudden, this threat from Trump comes in, and you see Justin Trudeau has been talking about Canada being the example of the first post-national country in the new world order that really doesn't have, a strong sense of self-identity. And all of a sudden he comes out and he's waving the Canadian flag and he's talking about, vacationing not outside Canada and going to provincial parks and not getting on a private jet or staying at billionaires' islands over the holidays. And it's just mind-boggling to me how this had to happen. And then all of a sudden we're talking about Canada and how proud we are to be Canadians. I haven't heard anything celebratory of Canadian in a real meaningful way in a very, very long time. 20 years ago, if there was an external threat to Canada, the reaction would have been very different, other than just, virtual signaling on social media. We were a lot scrappier of a country back then, and I think we used to have a lot more heart. Now, it's good to see some of this coming back, but I think we've lost a lot of identity over the way, and it's really unfortunate to see. So, if you take a step back, it really looks like we're waking up. We got slapped. We got slapped by somebody a lot bigger than us, and all of a sudden, talking about internal drug problems, talking about border security, talking about energy, talking about internal trade, looking at how we're overtaxed, looking at more efficient ways to run our economy, talking about real conversations about immigration and the problems that we've had in our system, being proud to be a Canadian, waving a flag and what that means, and not being American. None of this was on the bingo card a few months ago. And so, regardless again of your perspective of the tariffs and Trump trying to accomplish, as a Canadian, I feel like the whole paradigm has dramatically changed, and so has the conversation, and for the better. And where is this all going to go? I mean, I have no idea. I just read a stat, and it basically talked about how aged under 30 years old, for Canadians aged under 30 years old, we ranked 58th in happiness. There are so many fundamental problems in Canada, and finally we're starting to talk about them, and finally we're starting to talk about some of the solutions to these problems. And I think if you really want to get down to where this is all going, it really is going to come down to who we choose to represent us in the next elections as our government, and what kind of a message that choice is going to send to the United States. And I don't think that the stakes could be a lot higher. So where is this all going? I think it's really going to be determined by where Canadians choose to have this all go. And my hope is that all of these issues that we've talked about become even greater in conversation in the Canadian dialogue about our future and how we look at ourselves and how we want to project ourselves into the future. So I think a lot of good has come from this. All parties have now shifted their perspective. I think, in my opinion, definitely for the better. This could be a real positive moment for Canada, and if we embrace it, or we could set ourselves up for a lot worse than what we've already experienced should we make the wrong choice in the next few months and hopefully an upcoming election. So there are my thoughts on it. I hope you enjoyed this little talk. And if you have any questions or comments, absolutely would love to hear from you down below. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to hit that like or subscribe button.